Hello, my name is Bill Truels. I am a general surgeon in Oklahoma City. I'm semi-retired. I'm now 71 years old. I went to college at Northwestern, graduated in 1967, went to Indiana University, got a master's in biochemistry in 69, and then in 1973 I graduated from the University of Illinois Medical School, and then I came to Oklahoma City, did my surgery training at University of Oklahoma and St. Anthony Hospital, and started my surgery practice in 1979. And I've been doing surgery for about 35 years, and then now lately I've been doing wound surgery, wound management, and carrying on at Deaconess Hospital in Oklahoma City. I'm here today to talk about the curious illness and death of one of our greatest presidents, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. These are accounts that have been told to me by two separate groups of doctors in my years of scrubbing at the operating room and talking in the doctor's lounge, and talking to some of my patients as well. When I get done, see them in the office after they've had their surgery, a lot of times I'll talk to them about what they did in their career. And from this I've got some stories, basically stories that I can't prove, about the illness and death of FDR, and I'll share them with you. Now, officially, FDR, at the age of 39 in the year 1921, was stricken with polio. Now, it's kind of a funny form of polio that he had because, for one thing, polio is infantile paralysis, and FDR was 39 years old, had 5 kids, I believe, at that time, with Eleanor. How do you get polio at the age of 39? It's pretty unusual. In addition, polio usually affects one limb, the left leg or the right leg, but with FDR, both legs were affected. In addition, usually the legs are insensate or don't have feeling, but with FDR he had terrible pain in his legs. In addition, polio doesn't usually affect the bowel function or the bladder function, but with FDR he had compromised bowel and bladder function. So it's kind of a funny kind of polio that he had. In addition, polio doesn't usually keep on progressing through the years. Usually you have it once. If you survive it, you get over it, and you may have certain post-polio syndrome symptoms, but usually not to the severe extent that FDR had, with severe headaches and muscle pain and aches in his early days. So it was a funny kind of polio that he had, and various doctors have reviewed the literature. Now, keep in mind, we don't have any health records of FDR. They were all, after FDR's death, put in a vault in Bethesda, Maryland, and then 3 weeks after that they all disappeared. So people that have done research to try to find out what was wrong with FDR have been very compromised in what information they can get a hold of from a medical record standpoint. So FDR got polio at the age of 39 in 1921, which was very unusual for the factors that I've just mentioned. So other doctors come along and said, well, what could he have had? And they've speculated and said, well, maybe what he had was a disease called Guillain-Barré. And Guillain-Barré is an autoimmune disease that was more like what happened to FDR in those early days when he was stricken with paralysis in both legs and inability for the bowel and bladder to function as well. And this is something that would be more compatible with Guillain-Barré disease, which is considered an autoimmune type disease. The problem with Guillain-Barré is that it also doesn't usually keep on going year after year after year. You know, FDR was sick in 1921, but in 1945 the symptoms were progressing and he was on death's door. There was a gradual progression of these symptoms, whereas with Guillain-Barré, it usually strikes you once, and then if you survive it and get over it, you usually don't have progressive symptoms going up the spinal cord, affecting the arms, and so on and so forth. So it doesn't totally fit Guillain-Barré disease either. Now, a third consideration for FDR's illness had to do with the fact that in the later years, in 1940 and beyond, up until his death in 1945, he started having memory problems, severe headaches, migraines, vision problems, symptoms related to the brain, the central nervous system, beyond the level of the spinal cord, where he had his paralysis and used leg braces and cane. Now, authors have noted that there was a mole above the left eye of FDR, which subsequently was removed, and you can see in later pictures that there was a scar there. And there's evidence that he may have had a melanoma, which is a skin cancer, and the speculation is that he developed a melanoma that spread to the brain, a brain tumor, which caused these symptoms that he was having. Some of these symptoms were confabulation, where you start talking about a false memory. In a way, I guess it's a form of psychosis. FDR had pinned a medal onto a serviceman and said, well, this is the second time you won a medal. Congratulations. Well, the serviceman had only had this. This was the first time that he was awarded this medal. And people told him, and that people that were being introduced to FDR were often told sometimes FDR will say things that are not true, and the best thing to do is just ignore them and nod and not ask any questions. So the fancy word for this is confabulation, where you talk about memories that are false. And towards the later years, especially in the last year of his life, there was this confabulation going on, and also short-term memory issues that were going on. And actually the Harry Hopkins Brain Trust, as it's called, was sort of running the country. FDR was signing documents that had been passed, but he himself was what some people call the quarterback, that they would prepare the documents for FDR to sign and he would sign off on them. But in fact, he was more like an injured reserve player, because he wasn't really in the game. It was the Brain Trust, the Harry Hopkins Brain Trust, and others that were really making the crucial decisions. In fact, I'll talk later about Harry Truman never really made the decision to pick Harry Truman. FDR never really made the decision to pick Harry Truman for his vice president. This is a man that he only met once, but this was arranged for him by his handlers, and we'll get into that later in the video. So FDR was having memory problems, he was having confabulation, and the authors now speculate, well, what FDR's illness was first polio, or some unusual form of polio, and then followed by a metastatic brain tumor that caused his memory loss and his confabulation. They even had an English orator hired to give speeches, because, especially we're talking about on the radio, where people wouldn't know it wasn't FDR, because FDR couldn't be trusted to stay to his script, and sometimes would start talking in a wandering way instead of giving his speech as he was supposed to. In fact, there was real concern at his State of the Union speech in January of 1945 that he was going to wander off and not give the correct speech. So there were memory problems going on, in addition to what was explained as an unusual form of polio, followed by a metastatic brain tumor that caused his mental confusion. But there's another explanation here that I'm going to get into next. In my first 10 years of general surgery practice, I worked with a Dr. Neil Woodward. He's a colorectal specialist, and I believe the most prominent colorectal surgeon in the state of Oklahoma during this time period, from 1979, really almost to the year 2000. And Dr. Neil Woodward was the busiest colorectal surgeon in town, and had the best reputation. He was also the chairman of the Department of Surgery at Mercy, and I worked with him regularly on colorectal cases. What Dr. Woodward told me after knowing him for several years was that his father, who was also a general surgeon and colorectal surgeon, had gone to a scientific meeting, a colorectal meeting, and during the speech or after the lecture was over, a number of the surgeons walked up and talked to the lecturer, and he was a lecturer who had been one of the doctors on the team that was called upon to find out what was wrong with FDR in 1940s. In March of 1944, a Dr. McIntyre, who was FDR's family doctor, hired a Dr. Howard Brune, a naval doctor, cardiologist, to look into FDR's problems. And Dr. Brune determined that FDR had hypertension, rather significant, with systolic pressures of 190, and that he also had congestive heart failure. But Dr. Brune didn't feel totally comfortable being the only one analyzing FDR's health, so he enjoined a committee which included a Dr. Frank Leahy, one of the most prominent surgeons of the day, and a few other non-surgeons that were on the team that evaluated FDR. Now, one of these doctors was giving a lecture to the colorectal surgeons, and Dr. Neil Woodward Sr., the father of the surgeon that I worked with, Dr. Neil Woodward Jr., was at this lecture, and the speaker, who may have been Dr. Frank Leahy or one of the other members of FDR's evaluation team, made the statement to Dr. Neil Woodward Sr. that FDR had a positive VDRL on his spinal fluid. Now, this was a rather dramatic thing, and I can't vouch for it. I can only say that this is word of mouth that is passed on from one surgeon to another and then to me. And I don't know if it was Dr. Leahy that was the lecturer that day, or one of the other members of the surgical team that evaluated FDR. But Dr. Leahy did write a memorandum. It's called the Leahy Memorandum, which years later, decades later, was released, in which Dr. Leahy gave the opinion that FDR was not going to survive another 4 years as a president, and probably advised him not to run. But this was a memorandum that had been written, did not disclose the exact illness that FDR had in this memorandum. So the information I'm relaying to you can't be verified. You can look in the internet, and there are other stories about syphilis and neurosyphilis, which is syphilis in the spinal cord and brain, that was very common. It's been speculated that 1 out of 10 individuals who were sexually active in the turn of the century, in the 1900s, the first 50 years before there was a cure for syphilis with penicillin, that 1 out of 10 people had syphilis and the symptoms of syphilis. When I was a medical student at University of Illinois, one of the things I was told as a freshman was that if you knew syphilis, you knew medicine. In those days, there were entire wards with syphilis patients in them because it was such a common disease, and the arsenic salts that were used to inject into these patients were not all that effective. Heavy metal salts were used to inject to slow down the process of the disease, but this was not a cure. So syphilis, if you will, was the elephant in the room when it came to diagnosis somebody that had confabulation and neurologic problems. It's not a presidential disease. Everybody knows that Al Capone had neurosyphilis, but it's not something probably that would be reported to the general public. Now I'm going to read to you a list of signs and symptoms of neurosyphilis. I'm not an expert in this field at all. I'm a general surgeon. But it's interesting to note that FDR had every one of these symptoms. That doesn't mean he had syphilis, but he certainly would be a consideration. Signs and symptoms of neurosyphilis: abnormal gait or abnormal walking, blindness. FDR had difficulty with vision, confusion, disorientation. We've already gone over this. Sudden personality changes. Sometimes he would start crying sometimes at an unpredictable moment, and this was something new in his behavior. Changes in mental stability. Dementia. Well, he was having memory problems. Depression was very common in several of the books that you can read about FDR in his later days especially. Headache. He had severe migraine headaches. Fecal and urinary incontinence. We mentioned he had this as well, even in 1921 when he was first stricken with what was labeled as polio. Irritability, memory problems, mood disturbances associated with neurosyphilis, numbness in the toes, feet, or legs, poor concentration, psychosis. If you have a false memory of something, that is a form of a psychosis, and FDR had false memories. Seizures. He had several seizures during the last weeks that he was alive. Neck stiffness was very common that he complained about. Tremors. He had the right hand that was trembling quite frequently. Visual disturbances associated with neurosyphilis. Muscle weakness. In addition to these signs and symptoms, the president also had an x-ray, a chest x-ray. And if you look at the result, which is available, or the report of the result is available, that is reported that he had a ascending and transverse arch of the aorta, which were dilated. Now, the ascending and transverse arch of the aorta being dilated is more commonly seen in syphilitic patients. It also is associated with hardening of the arteries or arteriosclerosis. This typically tends to be in the lower portions of the aorta when you have that. So when you see a swollen ascending or transverse arch of the aorta back in the 1940s, a lot of times this was a very strong indication of syphilis involving the blood vessels. Also, you can have abnormal reflexes, muscle atrophy, and muscle contractions. So, as I mentioned, FDR had basically all the symptoms and signs of neurosyphilis. That doesn't mean he had neurosyphilis, but certainly it would be something that you'd want to have in your differential diagnosis. Now, one characteristic of neurosyphilis is that it's in the late stages, the tertiary stages of syphilis. It takes 10 or 20 years for neurosyphilis to develop, to get a positive VDRL in the spinal fluid. Now, if FDR had this diagnosis made in 1944, when this group of doctors had gotten together to find out what was wrong with FDR, and it takes 10 or 20 years for tertiary or neurosyphilis to develop, then he could have gotten it as early as 1920. And we mentioned in 1921 that Roosevelt was stricken with an unusual form of polio. Now, this raises the question of whether this initial attack that Roosevelt had was due to syphilis. There is a condition which is called ascending myelitis, which means a infection going up or inflammation going up the spinal cord. And this can be associated with syphilis. There were something like 200 reported cases in one study that I found of an ascending myelitis, where you get a progressive paralysis going up the legs, also affecting the bowel and the bladder, and can often be fatal if it continues to then go up to the arms and then affect the breathing. So an ascending myelitis is something that can be associated with secondary syphilis. And then the question would be, well, did Roosevelt ever have a primary skin lesion or chancre somewhere even before then? and that he may have just shrugged off, and many people shrugged it off just as a skin lesion and didn't worry about what it meant. And the other possibility is that FDR's doctor recognized that this was a syphilitic myelitis that occurred in 1921, and that they began at that time to give arsenic injections and so on when they opened up the clinic in Warm Springs. It was opened up as a clinic for polio patients, but was in fact FDR receiving arsenic injections for syphilis, which was the treatment in those days before penicillin came along, and that this polio was, if you will, a cover. It's hard to say. You don't really know, and I'm being entirely speculative here. The good that FDR did for the polio patients at Warm Springs is unparalleled at a time when polio was affecting all these young kids, and he's to be praised for opening up the clinic and visiting it something like 60 times during his life. But it's an interesting, curious question. We'll never know because we don't have the medical records, and that did in fact FDR have an ascending myelitis from syphilis in 1921, and subsequently receiving arsenicals. Of course, he wouldn't want to tell anybody about this because that would end his political career. And as I mentioned, syphilis was a very common disease in those days, the most common neurologic disease in that time period because there was no cure for it. So again, this is speculation on my part, but it would explain why the paralysis that he had in 1921 was not typical for polio and really not typical for Guillain-Barré. Now, in one sense, you could argue that it really doesn't matter what illness FDR had. Did he have post-polio syndrome following his polio? Did he have Guillain-Barré? Did he have metastatic melanoma that went to the brain? Did he have syphilis that went to the brain? It doesn't really matter. I know in one sense, it doesn't matter. And that is when I was a medical student, the most important thing they said that you could do is physical exam. That tells the story more than anything else. And a physical exam was conducted by this group of doctors on FDR in March of 1944 at the request of Dr. McIntyre, who hired Dr. Brune to be FDR's personal physician, but also recruited other doctors, including a Dr. Frank Leahy, one of the most prominent surgeons of the day and well-respected surgeons of the day. A surgeon who believed in treating people as human beings. Always when he was operating, he would tell his students, residents, remember, these are human beings we're working with, a compassionate man, not somebody with a God syndrome, but a genuine human being with compassion for his patients. And what would happen if FDR had a physical exam? Which he did. And the short answer is that FDR would fail a neurologic exam to be president. In other words, just a physical exam is all you would need to see a president whose arm is trembling, who's having seizures, and also who's confabulating and making up stories that if you give him a piece of paper to read, he might get halfway through it and then start making the rest of it up, and what's called confabulation. And if you saw this and you were the doctor examining him, you say, this man should not run for president because he's not making his own decisions. Other people are making the decisions for him, and he cannot be trusted to wander off in the middle of a conversation and with some kind of nonsensical talk, form of dementia. So Roosevelt would fail any neurologic exam, and so the report then would be not to let FDR be president. And what does this do at the time, the Democratic Party was divided between the pro-communist and the anti-communist forces that were developing. People were becoming suspicious of Stalin near the end of the war in 1944 and 1945, that he was in a land grab for Eastern Europe, which he was. And there was the pro-communist faction within the Democratic Party with Harry Hopkins and the Brain Trust, and with FDR himself, who felt a high regard for Stalin, versus the anti-communist forces within the Democratic Party. And we'll get into those a little bit later. So the point is that after this exam by this group of doctors, the anti-communist forces now had leverage that they could use in the selection of a vice president. And instead of picking Henry Wallace, who was FDR's choice and the most popular choice of the day, they picked Harry Truman, who had a more aggressive stance against the Russians. It was Harry Truman who said, when Germany invaded Russia, he said, we'll support Russia if they're losing, and then we'll support Germany if they're losing against the Russians, so the two sides can knock each other out. The Russians and Joe Stalin didn't appreciate that kind of talk from Harry Truman. But again, the anti-communist forces in the Democratic Party now had leverage that they could use against the upcoming Democratic Convention. Dr. Leahy wrote his memorandum about FDR's not recommended to survive for 4 years, in Dr. Leahy's opinion, in this memorandum. And this would be information that the anti-communist elements within the Democratic Party could say, we want to pick and put Harry Truman in as vice president. If you don't do that, if you try to put in Henry Wallace, we're going to make public the results of FDR's physical exam and lab reports. So that would be a bargaining chip that could be used against Henry Wallace and his anti-communist elements within the Democratic Party could use it to get Harry Truman on the vice presidential ticket. Let's go over a little bit some of these anti-communist individuals within the Democratic Party. You had Frank C. Walker, who was the outgoing Democratic National Committee chairman. You had a man named Robert Hannigan from St. Louis, who was a strong supporter of Harry Truman. You had the party treasurer, Edwin W. Pauley, who was a big oil man from California and buddies with Richardson and Murchison in Texas. You had Mayor Edwin Joseph Kelly of Chicago, and you had lobbyist George E. Allen. They all wanted to keep Wallace off of the ticket, and their group was deemed by Allen as the, quote, the conspiracy of the pure in heart. Now, one of the things that's interesting about the oilman, the California oilman Ed Pauley, was that he frequented a racetrack at the Del Mar Turf Club, and he opened up a hotel called the Hotel del Charro in 1951, but before that he was at the Casa Mañana Hotel, which he tried to buy but which they would not sell, so he started his own hotel. But even before 1951, visiting the Casa Mañana Hotel, they would race the horses typically in July and August. And members who would come would be, one of the regulars was J. Edgar Hoover, who loved to race, loved to go to the races. He even later had a chair near the finish line installed at the Del Mar Turf Club because of his affinity for going there. So J. Edgar Hoover, Ed Pauley, the oil man, and his buddies, Clint Murchison, Sid Richardson, used to frequent the Del Mar Turf Club in the 1940s, and were all strongly opposed to Henry Wallace and strongly in favor of Harry Truman, who was more of a anti-communist than Henry Wallace, who actually for a while was a card-carrying member, some said, of the Communist Party, but actually was simply very good friends with the Russians, and had visited Russia, even had gone to Siberia, where the laborers are working, and thought that they were did not realize that they were conscripted workers there, and was somewhat naive, he later stated, about his ideas about Joe Stalin. But in those days, he was a strong supporter of Joe Stalin. So there was a strong move to unseat Henry Wallace from the vice presidency, and knowing that FDR was not going to finish out a fourth term, and this would give an opportunity for an anti-communist president to step in, who was a little less friendly to Joe Stalin than FDR was. So I thought that was interesting, because there are some parallels really with the oilmen and J. Edgar Hoover with the Kennedy assassination in the next 2 decades. So that's kind of an interesting overlay. And with regard to J. Edgar Hoover, you say, well, why was he so strongly anti-communist? They had documented that the spies at Los Alamos were passing secrets to the Russians. And in addition, they were passing the materials to make an atomic bomb, including radioactive materials such as uranium ore and aluminum rods that were shipped by way of Harry Hopkins and his Lend-Lease program to Russia to help them construct their first atomic bomb, which was a carbon copy of our atomic bomb. So J. Edgar Hoover went to FDR and said, look, there's spies at Los Alamos that are passing secrets on to the Russians. And FDR told J. Edgar Hoover, don't worry about it. The Russians are our friends. And FDR was not at all concerned about atomic secrets going to the Russians, and even atomic bomb materials going to the Russians by way of Lend-Lease. So there was an anti-communist group that was forming, and it's also highlighted in a book by Oliver Stone, where he talks about Ed Pauley and Richard Hannigan and others that were strong supporters of an anti-communist element within the Democratic Party in 1944. And let's not leave out the intelligence group, who were also very strongly anti-communist. In those days, it was the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which later became morphed into the CIA under Harry Truman. But Allen Dulles was conducting interviews with the Germans in Bern, Switzerland. And he was doing this without FDR's knowledge or approval. And basically it was called Operation Sunrise. And what Allen Dulles was doing is negotiating with the Germans in Italy and surrounding areas to surrender, and thus facilitate the Allies moving into Italy and even parts of Trieste to get there before the Russians did, because people were beginning to realize that the Yalta Conference was not being adhered to by Joe Stalin. He agreed that he would call for free elections, but by the time Roosevelt died, even in Roosevelt's last week, he was already violating the Yalta Agreement, and Roosevelt was visibly upset at that time for Joe Stalin not adhering to the Yalta Conference agreements. But Allen Dulles was busy conducting interrogations with the German officers at the highest level to get them to surrender sooner, so that the Allies could take over Italy and other areas more quickly and get there before the Russians did. Well, Joe Stalin got wind of this, and he wrote a letter to FDR and said, "What is going on here?" And FDR wrote back and says, "I don't know what you're talking about." FDR was not in the loop. And here's Allen Dulles conducting negotiations, kind of acting like he was the president. And he was criticized by FDR in several letters. Now, the letters were not written by FDR, they were written by his supporters, and then FDR would sign the letters. To be specific, there were 3 letters that were written to Stalin by FDR, but the letters were actually drafted by Admiral Leahy with the assistance of Secretary Stimson and General Marshall, and approved by the President with minor revisions. So even now you see that FDR is not really calling the shots. The letters are being written by these individuals, and then he's signing them. But basically, Allen Dulles was going against the advice of Harry Hopkins and the military, and conducting his own negotiations. Now, there was a letter that was written April the 10th by Roosevelt, in which he wrote back to Dulles and said, "We're not going to conduct any more negotiation with the Germans unless Joe Stalin and the Russians are present. Specifically, Russian members are present as well." And basically, FDR was admonishing Allen Dulles. And April 12th, 2 days later, after this letter was written, FDR suddenly dies. So it was very convenient for Allen Dulles that Roosevelt would die when he did, because in the process of Harry Truman taking over, there was a little bit of confusion, and Allen Dulles was able to take advantage of that confusion to continue with his negotiations. And then when the Germans did surrender, Operation Sunrise was hailed as a great success because it got the Germans to surrender sooner, and perhaps 850,000 German troops were kept from going to the Russian lines and fighting over there, and ended the war sooner in the West. But Joe Stalin was not at all happy about this. He felt that this was a breach of trust. And in Oliver Stone's book, he talks about the fact that this may actually be the start of the Cold War, where now Joe Stalin doesn't trust the Allies with regards to what they're going to do with post-war Europe. So some people say that this was the beginning of the Cold War, that Operation Sunrise, while it was hailed as a success, years later the revisionists have come along and said, wait a second, that was the beginning of the Cold War. So it's all in how you look at it, but basically the intelligence services, Allen Dulles, were basically acting as president without the president's approval and making decisions without FDR's approval. And you'd have to say that FDR had not died when he did, that there's a possibility, to my way of thinking, that they would have court-martialed Allen Dulles for carrying on negotiations in Operation Sunrise without Roosevelt's approval. I'm going to read you one quote from a man named Murray N. Rothbard, and he states in one of his books that the death of FDR is perhaps the most mysterious death of all. Regarding Roosevelt's strange death, Rothbard reports all sorts of rumors abounded, that he died of syphilis or of a gunshot wound, either self-inflicted or inflicted by someone else. And Rothbard also states that after World War II, the old right was derailed by an interventionist group of anti-communist crusaders who called for a global war against communism. And he entitles this book The Betrayal of the American Right. So there was a shift in policy from being pro-communist to anti-communist with the rise of Harry Truman and the demise of FDR. And we'll get into FDR's demise next. Now let's go to the next section, which is FDR's demise. This again is information that I cannot verify, and it will only take probably an autopsy on FDR to verify these things. Until then, it also will remain speculation, but I think it needs to be verbalized. I worked with the most prominent breast surgeon in the state of Oklahoma. His name is Dr. Carl Boatman, and he was the breast surgery specialist, in my opinion, for the entire state of Oklahoma. Had a very good reputation, was chairman of the Department of Surgery at Baptist Hospital in Oklahoma City for many years. And I worked with Dr. Boatman, and one day he shared an account with me. He said that as we had gotten talking somehow about FDR, and he said that he, Dr. Boatman, had worked with a Dr. Harlan Sowell, S-O-W-E-L-L, who was his anesthesiologist for many years. And Dr. Sowell and he would go on hunting trips. And at one hunting trip, Dr. Sowell talked to Dr. Boatman and said, I got a letter from Dr. Brune. Dr. Brune, B-R-U-E-H-N, I believe it's spelled, was FDR's doctor in Warm Springs that had been appointed by Dr. McIntyre in March of 1944. And Dr. Brune would accompany FDR to Warm Springs. And Dr. Sowell, the anesthesiologist, Harlan Sowell was his name, was in the Navy. And he befriended Dr. Brune before he was assigned to be FDR's doctor. Anyway, years after the war, Dr. Brune wrote Dr. Sowell in a letter, and wrote in this letter that FDR died from a cerebral hemorrhage, all right, but it was from a .38 caliber bullet. When I heard that, I was in a state of shock, because the official story is that FDR died from a cerebral hemorrhage, as to say a stroke. I thought it was interesting when I researched it that they didn't bother to take FDR to the hospital, which was 5 minutes away after he had this supposed stroke. They just immediately put him in bed and said that they knew that he was a dying man, which is a little unusual. Usually, even if somebody has a massive stroke, you take them to the hospital, which is 5 minutes away, especially if they're president of the United States. But the argument was, well, this stroke was so bad that there's no point in even taking him to the hospital. But of course, by doing so, there was a limit as to who saw FDR's body, and limited the witnesses that would have verified the account. In addition, autopsy was refused by Eleanor. So you had a situation where also the left side of the head and neck was swollen. And I thought, well, that's unusual. That doesn't happen with a stroke. And Eleanor Roosevelt later said, well, the reason that the left side of the head and neck were swollen was because there was an embalming error. And the problem with that argument was that the swelling occurred before he was embalmed, that witnesses at Warm Springs noticed that there was swelling on the left side of the head and neck before embalming. So there was certain kind of inconsistencies there in the story as to the exact cause of FDR's demise. In addition, Eleanor Roosevelt made the statement that her husband died like a soldier. And I'm thinking, well, a soldier doesn't usually die from a stroke. A soldier usually dies from being shot. So I thought that was a little bit unusual. In addition, Eleanor Roosevelt would not let anybody view the remains. She insisted on a closed casket, which in 1945, typically there was, tradition was to have an open casket. And Eleanor would look at the casket and lift the lid of the casket, but only after she made everybody else in the rotunda left, and she was the only one there to view the body. And she didn't call her son to come back from the Pacific either, which was, in my opinion, a little unusual. But to finish the story, I mentioned that Dr. Harlan Saul, the anesthesiologist, told Dr. Boatman, the general surgeon, on a hunting trip that he had received a letter and that FDR died from a cerebral hemorrhage, all right, but it was from a .38 caliber bullet. Years later, I had occasion to work with Dr. Harlan Saul's son, Doug Saul. He was a podiatrist that worked in our wound clinic. I had never met Dr. Harlan Saul, but I saw his son, who was a podiatrist, and Dr. Doug Saul was a very prominent podiatrist, the head of the Podiatry Association nationwide. He was a highly respected podiatrist that worked in our wound clinic, and very good with the patients as well, very thorough. So one day I asked Dr. Doug Saul, the son of Harlan Saul, and I said, you know, Dr. Boatman told me a story about your dad that his dad had since passed on, and he said that your dad had received a letter from Dr. Brune, and this Dr. Brune said that FDR died from a cerebral hemorrhage, all right, but it was from a .38 caliber bullet. And at first, Dr. Saul really didn't say anything, and didn't really give me an answer. But he just kind of hesitated a little bit and didn't say anything. He said he didn't know anything about it. And then about 6 months later, after I got to know Dr. Saul better, and he worked in our clinic quite a bit, he said, Bill, he says, there's one thing I need to tell you. When you asked me about a letter that my dad received from a Dr. Brune regarding a .38 caliber bullet to FDR, he said, yes, he said that was true, but that he had been reluctant to reveal it. And he said, and I said, well, if you could find that letter, I said, I'll pay you $1,000 for that letter. You know, I mean, that would be a tremendous thing to see. And Dr. Saul replied that he had looked for a letter but did not find one. So we just have the verbal, two doctors, Dr. Boatman and Dr. Doug Saul, that verbally told me that FDR died from a cerebral hemorrhage, all right, but it was from a .38 caliber bullet, and that came from Dr. Brune, who had befriended Dr. Saul's father while they were both in the Navy together. So I thought that was quite amazing piece of information. And again, I can't verify that this is true. This is just a word of mouth type of situation. Now I then took it upon myself to do a little bit of research, and I found that FDR slept with a gun under his pillow. Oliver North in War Stories gave that account, that even though FDR said we have nothing to fear but fear itself, in the documentary Oliver North says that FDR slept with a .32 caliber pistol under his pillow every night. And if you go on the internet, you can find pictures of FDR's .32 caliber pistol. It was kind of a little bit unusual. It had a safety on it that involved squeezing the handle, and you would release the safety, which is on the top of the handle, kind of in one piece with your hand. So I thought that was interesting. But the other interesting thing is that FDR's gun was a .32 caliber, but the word that I got from Dr. Boatman and Dr. Saul was that this was a .38 caliber bullet that Roosevelt died from. Now, the only way they would probably know that is if the pistol was dropped there at the scene, that they would say the .38 caliber gun, and it was dropped at the scene. So then I did a little bit of research to try to find, was there a pistol dropped at the scene where FDR was. Another interesting point that you can find by doing a little bit of research is that a number of individuals, some of them on shipboard in the Pacific, others in department stores on overhead speakers, stated that the first announcement of FDR's death was that he had shot himself, and that shortly thereafter, maybe a half hour later or an hour later, the account came out that this was a cerebral hemorrhage that he died from. Now, I know that J. Edgar Hoover always believed that it was important to get something out right away after an assassination. And it's very possible, we know that Hoover also was involved in intimidating witnesses that were in Warm Springs. He conducted an investigation in which the witnesses were told basically to keep their mouths shut. And individuals who had worked at the morgue were visited by the FBI and told to keep their mouths shut, kind of like shades of what happened after the JFK assassination with witnesses. But J. Edgar Hoover conducted the investigation afterwards and basically told everybody to keep their mouths shut. So that was another interesting point. So these are issues that haven't been totally resolved. Now, some have asked, well, why would Eleanor Roosevelt not want to have an autopsy if her husband had been shot and there was an assassin, and perhaps this was an assassination? And one answer would be that if, in fact, FDR did have syphilis, that this would be not the kind of thing you'd want to have come out for a autopsy and public knowledge. The other thing is that the country was at war, and if Eleanor was told that someone had shot FDR or that he committed suicide, it would be something that she wouldn't want the public to necessarily be aware of. So Eleanor, out of compassion for her husband's reputation, may have agreed that there should not be an autopsy, but by so doing, it's very possible that an assassination was covered up. In fact, when Eleanor said that her husband died like a soldier, you have to think that she may have been told that he was shot by somebody, and that she was willing to cover it up as the country was at war. So these are issues that haven't been totally resolved. Another interesting point here is that the Secret Service was nowhere to be found. Lucy Rutherford said, where was the Secret Service? Now, why would you be, first of all, where was the Secret Service? They were apparently at their post, which was 10 or 15 minutes away at the time that FDR died. What's going on there? I thought they were always supposed to be within a few dozen feet of the president at any given time. And it's interesting that Harry Truman, upon taking the presidency, instead of accepting those same Secret Service agents for his protection, he sent them all off to the Pacific to fight in the war, which is an unusual thing to do. Some people view that as a form of punishment. If FDR had been assassinated, then was the Secret Service compromised? In addition, Harry Truman also fired the chief of the Secret Service. So that also is an interesting situation. I think that when you realize that FDR's death occurred at a very crucial point, I mean, the exact day that he died, there was an argument going on against Allen Dulles, who, in my opinion, was assuming presidential powers by carrying out his own negotiations with the Germans against FDR's desires. And the very day that FDR died was very crucial because it allowed Allen Dulles to keep up his negotiations until Harry Truman could take over, and in the confusion of the takeover, it gave Allen Dulles a few more weeks to carry out his negotiations, which were successful, and then Harry Truman turned around and accepted the settlement that Operation Sunrise had achieved. So the fact that FDR's demise occurred at such a crucial time, when actually, if FDR had lived, then it's very possible that Ellen Dulles will have been branded a traitor. You know, who knows what FDR would have done for undermining Stalin's confidence in FDR and Winston Churchill. So it's hard to say what would have happened historically. The other point is that the whole idea of having Harry Truman as your vice president would be that he would someday take over, hopefully before the Russians took over all of Europe, and that it was very important that Truman take over when he did. If they had waited several more weeks or months, Stalin's forces could have, according to Allen Dulles, even taken over Italy. So it was a very crucial point that FDR died, and I think the whole idea of having Truman available as vice president is that he had to be brought in at the time that he was brought in order to keep, in the views of Allen Dulles, to keep the Russians from taking over all of Western Europe. So I think that the timing of it was so crucial that you have to, that it would, in my opinion, lean towards an assassination to change the course of the country from a pro-communist to an anti-communist stance. Also, don't forget the role of the military generals. General Patton was absolutely furious that Eisenhower's diverted to Trieste instead of going to Berlin. That Patton felt that there was not enough aggression on the part of the Allied forces to take over Germany, and he was furious with Roosevelt. Curtis LeMay is another one who had a deep distrust of the Russians, and after he formed the Bomber Strategic Air Command flights, there was even a proposal by some of the generals, including at one point Curtis LeMay, that there was an argument being made for a preemptive strike in the early 50s against the Russians to keep them from developing the atomic bomb. They felt that only the Americans should have the atomic bomb. So there was a lot of animosity being generated on the part of the generals and the intelligence agencies against the Russians at that time that a lot of people are not aware of. I think the American people have a right to know what happened to FDR and to draw appropriate conclusions from any determinations that are made. But until we get the autopsy information, then this will remain in the realm of speculation. So what you had here was a battle going on between the hawks and the doves in the Democratic Party, the pro-communist versus the anti-communist factions. And FDR was part of the pro-communist faction. He was supporting Joe Stalin. And even at Yalta, Winston Churchill was afraid to let FDR be alone with Joe Stalin because he was afraid what FDR might give into. And so Winston Churchill insisted on being present whenever FDR and Stalin were together. But there was a battle going on between the pro-communists and the anti-communists. And in March of 1944, with Roosevelt's health becoming an issue, whether it be due to the positive VDRL in the spinal fluid, which my sources suggested is the case, or whether you want to say it was metastatic melanoma to the brain, or an unusual form of Guillain-Barré, or an unusual form of polio. Either way, there was something terribly wrong with FDR. He was confabulating. He could not pass a neurologic exam. And his health then became a bargaining chip. And so the convention was to be held in July, 3 months after this exam in March of 1944. And Roosevelt did not even know Harry Truman. when he had met him one time, and he was not in favor of Truman's beliefs. But Roosevelt was pressured into accepting Truman because Roosevelt's poor health was now a bargaining chip, and the anti-communist elements within the Democratic Party could now say, look, if you don't let Harry Truman be the vice presidential candidate, we're going to blow the whistle on FDR and his health and let the American people know that FDR is compromised and should not be running for president. So it was, but neither the pro or the anti-communists in the Democratic Party did not want Tom Dewey to win the presidency. So it was a deal made as a compromise, just like Lyndon Johnson was a compromise on the JFK ticket. The two of them had markedly opposing views, and Bobby Kennedy didn't even want to put the phone call through for Lyndon Johnson to accept the vice presidential candidacy. But you had differing viewpoints between the president and the vice president, a compromise ticket. And it was Roosevelt's health that pressured the Roosevelt supporters into accepting Truman on the vice presidential ticket. Now, the problem was that after the Yalta Conference, a lot of the anti-communists felt like Roosevelt wasn't dying fast enough. You know, he was still alive, he was still talking, he had problems, he was having seizures, he was having headaches, he had cerebral pain in his legs, he had all the symptoms that I've mentioned previously that are typical of neurosyphilis, but could be from a brain tumor as well, causing these. And with all these symptoms, he was still awake and still the president, and was in the eyes of the anti-communists and the spies, especially like Allen Dulles. They felt like FDR was making the wrong decisions and blocking Allen Dulles in his Operation Sunrise to negotiate with the Germans in Italy. So the problem was that Roosevelt wasn't dying fast enough for these anti-communist elements. Now, when Dr. Brune wrote this letter that I mentioned earlier to Dr. Saul about FDR dying from a bullet wound to the head, he just didn't call it a bullet wound to the head. He said it was a .38 caliber bullet wound to the head. And people knew that FDR's pistol that he slept with under his pillow was a .32 caliber pistol. So I think that Dr. Brune may have been letting Dr. Saul know that this wasn't at the hand of FDR, and suggests to me that it was a assassination. And there is a report on the internet, again, for what it's worth, of a small silver gun that was found next to FDR, and it could have even been a Derringer. It was .38 caliber. I know Lincoln was shot with a .44 caliber Derringer, but whatever the gun, it was not Roosevelt's own gun that he died from. And I think Dr. Brune was trying to let people know this wasn't a gunshot at the hands of FDR, that this was an assassination. Now, some people have said, well, gee, why didn't Dr. Brune come forward? I mean, he lived to be 90 years old. Why didn't he come forward 50 years later and say, hey, I want to tell you something, that FDR had been shot. Why didn't he make this public? And you have to think that he probably was told, you will not, under any circumstances, reveal this under penalty to you and your family. So in a way, he probably may have wanted to reveal this information, but knew that he couldn't do so publicly. I think it was also important that there be a doctor in Warm Springs to control the situation, because if there had not been a doctor in Warm Springs when FDR had this cerebral hemorrhage, or whatever it was, the normal situation would have been to rush him to the hospital. And had he been rushed to the hospital, then his health records may have become more widely known. If he had been shot, then that would have been more widely known as well. So there may very well have been a conscious attempt to keep a doctor at Warm Springs to to keep FDR from being transported to the hospital, because he lived another 5 or 6 hours or several hours later. And usually when a president is shot, the thing to do is to rush him to the hospital. You don't say, well, he's shot so bad that there's no point in going to the hospital. And what happened then is that the government could control the situation by keeping FDR at Warm Springs, much like Kennedy was controlled by making sure that the autopsy didn't occur in Dallas but occurred at Bethesda with military pathologists, where as I mentioned in my video about the JFK pathologists, as military pathologists they could be more easily compromised than civilian pathologists at Parkland. So it was important that Dr. Brune be told, if something terrible happens to FDR and he has a serious illness or serious accident or has a stroke, because it was known that he had high blood pressure, let's not take him to the hospital, because we don't want other elements of his health record to become public knowledge. Now, what's interesting is that with the 3 assassinations that I've studied, Huey Long, FDR, and JFK, in these videos, that there is a common thread. And the common thread is a battle between the hawks and the doves at the time. In the case of Huey Long, Huey was an isolationist. After World War I, nobody was anxious to go to war with Germany. And Bill Donovan was traveling in Europe and reporting back to FDR and telling him about the rise of Adolf Hitler, and that in a few more years there was going to be war. And the last thing that FDR wanted was Huey Long, an isolationist, to be president and the country not go to war against Germany. Now subsequently, FDR wasn't anxious to go to war against the rising communist threat, the beginning of the Cold War. It's very possible that FDR was the first casualty of the Cold War, because he was a pro-communist. Remember, Stalin had been on our side in World War II. And it was the anti-communist element, the hawks, in the Democratic administration who were pushing for FDR's overthrow. There was, in fact, a previous attempt, the so-called business plot, to get rid of FDR years earlier. So you had the hawks versus the doves, and in the case of FDR, he became a dove with regard to the communists, and the hawks overruled him, and you had the beginning of the Cold War. And Oliver Stone has an interesting book in this regard. And then JFK, again, was a dove against the communists. He was opposed to the battling the Russians at the Berlin Wall. He was opposed to battling the Russians in the Cuban Missile Crisis and attacking Cuba. And he was perceived as a dove against the rising communist threat, the so-called domino theory that Asia was going to fall into the hands of the communists if we didn't take action. So JFK was the dove, and the hawks won out, and LBJ, who was a hawk and a strong anti-communist, won out there as well. So you had a battle between the hawks and the doves in all 3 of these assassinations. Another common thread was J. Edgar Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover was present on the phone when Huey Long was assassinated, and gave out the name of the assassin before the others knew who it was. J. Edgar Hoover was involved with the cover-up of the FDR assassination, and went into Warm Springs with his agents and basically intimidated the witnesses. And similarly with the JFK assassination, the FBI intimidated witnesses, as we know, at the behest of J. Edgar Hoover. But in the case of J. Edgar Hoover, he was always acting as a facilitator for someone above him. He always had somebody above him who was giving the orders, and he himself was the facilitator because he wanted to keep his job, and he always had to have somebody above him who he could point to that was responsible. So J. Edgar Hoover was the facilitator for some of these assassinations. And the final point is, will we ever get to a point where we don't rely upon assassinations in order to change the will of the country or the ideas of the country. Is there a way to peacefully obtain these changes without assassination? And that's a deeper subject that would require a whole new video to try to understand. Thank you.